donar les gràcies al nostre convidat per acompanyar-nos avui i dir que aquesta és la 5a edició de l'Europa Europa, sexta, anem bé, anem millorant, i a partir d'aquí el comissari del cicle, que és el Moisés Puente, ens explicarà, ens farà una breu introducció a on estem avui. Gràcies.
Sí. Bueno, para quien no haya estado en otras jornadas, Europa lo que trata es como la réplica de un ciclo que se hizo el año pasado que trataba de ver qué es realmente lo que se está haciendo en el mundo contemporáneo, en la arquitectura. El año pasado fue del caso local, de estudios barceloneses, y este año lo hemos ampliado a Europa. Y bueno, ya es la 6ª conferencia. Yo también, para no hablar mucho, y ya lo habréis oído, y también para establecer como unos vínculos con el ámbito local, siempre invito a un estudio que lo presente. En este caso es Omar Ornaque, del estudio AMO, y aquí está su socio por aquí, Aureli Mora, y nada, va a haber mayoría absoluta de estudios belgas, este es el segundo, pero habrá otro, 59N4E, que lo digo en castellano, y hemos traído a bien, está aquí Frick Persson. Paso la palabra a Ornaque.
Bona tarda. Bona tarda a tothom. Good evening to all the attendees. To begin with, I would like to thank Moisés Puente for his invitation and congratulate al Col·legi d'Arquitectes de Catalunya on the initiative of carrying out this cycle of conferences with architectural studios as well as with other professionals around Europe. Undoubtedly, what we do at home is important, but we must never stop building bridges which allow us to see other ways of proceeding because, in the end, they enrich us. Moisés, who can sometimes be misleading, proposes a double shot of an almost Merkelian Europe, like a chupito Europa, nowadays so in the edge of the razor. It reminds me maybe with a mixture of the film of Luis García Berlanga, Bienvenido Mr. Marshall, Welcome Europe. In any case, we are going to present this 6th session. Today we have Frick Persson with us, the founder of the Belgian studio 51N4E, together with Johan Orin, set up back in 1998. Both were born in 1974 and graduated in St. Lucas, Brussels. Moreover, Frick has been studio tutor at the Berlitz Institute of Rotterdam and visiting professor at the Academy of Mendrisio. Today, 51N4E has a considerable size, at least in Spain, with about 20 people working for it. The final result is a remarkable combination of age, work, and of course, responsibility. After the studio's career of almost 20 years, it seems complicated to classify the work they have done in a specific style. Probably other contemporary studies have been concerned with defining or creating their own style. Although it is obvious that everyone is defining their image, even with their apparent lack of willingness to do so, here it appears difficult to decipher. They themselves define their aspirations on their website as those to contribute through means of design to social and urban transformation. The aspirations from the office are not little, and the tools to carry it out as an architect are not too powerful. That is the reason why, when we look at their projects, it is worth investigating the strategy, which should act as a lever to allow, from a relatively small effort, to achieve a great change. In this sense, and as an example, I would like to emphasize the way in which they face the extension for residents destined to the elderly, which I find defining. I don't know if you are going to explain this project today. Anyway, the strategy consists of simply taking into account the third user, who is not the resident nor the nurses, but the occasional visitor. Although the visitor's impact on the daily operation of the center is quite minimal, its impact on the residents' lives is capital. The residents expect and want to be visited. It would be even said that they live to be visited. Activating this vector, apparently simple, activates the strategy and changes the classical conception regarding the equipment's typology. This change, along with others, such as opening up the building to the surroundings and other stuff, are the lever which I referred to previously. The nursing home must not be seen as a parking, as something to hide to the fellow citizen. Rather, the old age should be seen as another vital stage of life without feeling ashamed of it. That is, moving away from the program and aspiring to something more. Here we see the studio's self-defining phrase or sentence, or at least aspirational, in which they want to contribute through means of design to social and human transformation. It is possible that even though their work has been awarded for their architectural projects and other achievements, this is one of the reasons, maybe, why they have carried out or are carrying out human projects of a bigger size in Bordeaux, Brussels and Istanbul. In any case, we have Frank Person here to explain their particularities, their vision and or strategies. And he will probably not agree with anything I've just said, but I think is that the reason why we have presentations. Thank you.
No, thank you very much for this nice introduction. I will not grant you the pleasure of disagreeing with it. It was actually very beautiful and very accurate. Thank you for that. Also, thank you all very much for coming tonight. It's an excellent venue to be in a very beautiful spot in the city, a European city. Europa is a very beautiful title for lecture series. And even if sometimes we feel that we are victim of political changes that happen amongst other places in Brussels where our office is based, we truly believe as an office that we can contribute to the city and especially also to the European city. It's a place where we have been born and raised, and the name 51 and 4E is also maybe a bit abstract denominator that talks about one of these cities, the city of Brussels, which is a city which is very telling for Europe as a whole, in the sense it's a very complex city, a very bureaucratic city as well, but also a very beautiful city with a lot of different inhabitants. And recently the amount of foreigners inhabiting the city has been a bigger percentage than the amount of native-born Brussels people. And so we witness very much every day the kind of future that the European city will become. And we still believe that architecture can contribute to shaping that future in a very interesting way. And and that's what I will try to talk about tonight, about how architecture can indeed contribute to transformation. And we believe very much that it's also about, if you want to do that, that it's about seeing architecture as a process itself, and to not only focus on the built result of architecture and on the incredible things that we want to achieve. And we, then I speak of the profession as a whole, but to become in a way more sensitive and more aware of the fact that these are very complex processes. And if you look at these processes in detail, with affection, with love, I could almost say, that there's a lot of value to be found in it. Of course, this is, sounds all very abstract. Transformation process in itself is already a very abstract word. And that's why I would like to make it maybe concrete by taking as an angle for this talk one of the European contexts that we have worked in since the very beginning, since 2004. So as a very fresh office, and that's the context of Albania. And so on this map you see the different contexts that we have worked in, and in varying degrees. But Albania is a very specific one, both inside of Europe and outside. So people, for instance, who have worked in Africa say that there's a lot of links between the dynamics in Albania and the dynamics in Africa. And for us it has been a real breeding ground. So we have worked there since 2004 with varying intensities. And a year ago we published a book that we published ourselves together with a friend editor from Ghent, Art Paper Editions, APE they are called. And we made this book, which is called How Things Meet. And I would like to take this book as a kind of red thread through the lecture, because it makes things very tangible. Also because we are very proud of the work in the book and of the book itself. And also because this book was an attempt to show architecture as a transformation process, and not just as a series of built results that jump off the glossy pages. So it was an exercise, and it's an exercise I would like to share. Maybe a few words about the book, the way it is structured. It actually consists out of two parts of equal size. And the first part is a part of which you see a sample page here. And it's actually, this part is made by Falma Shvazi, which is an Albanian writer, a woman, and Stefano Graziani, which is an Italian photographer. And together they, or in parallel, they produced the first part of the book, which is a photo novel, so which has our projects, but also the city of Tirana through the eyes of Stefano, and which has the process that we went through, that we shared with Falma, but that she somehow reinterpreted in a short story, in a short novel that consists of different pages. This photo novel also exists as a book on its own, and it is this book, this photo novel is also in that building, which has become a hotel. So the idea was to produce a book that allows people that visit the hotel to look at the city in the same way that we see beauty in the city, and to share that experience. In the beginning, the idea was to produce this photo novel and then to maybe add a small leaflet to add inside this photo novel, which would contain a few plans and a few explanations for our friend's architect. But gradually, when we were producing this, it somehow took a life of its own. It became as big as the photo novel, so they are in a way equal in size. And the second part basically became a timeline. So here you see the years. It goes from 2004 until 2016, when the book was published. And this list is a list of a selection of the projects that we started, that we attempted, that sometimes failed, sometimes didn't, sometimes were even successful. And then the black lines, you see where these projects in the book appear. And so what happens is that some of the projects, like the project of the TID Tower in Albania, features in different years, so it also features on different pages, and it is intersected with other projects. And so through this second part, you don't get just the plans of the built results, but you get a series of documents that we dug out of the archives that we explicitly didn't post-produce, but that we simply selected and put into a narrative to bring this narrative and to share it. The projects of the timeline are very diverse. It almost, in the end, feels like a sample of all of the moments in life. So we have made a grave, also a gas station. We have made a bridge. We have made this tower, and we are also currently producing the central square. So in that sense, Tirana has proven to become a very fertile context for us. And in retrospect, we think that is not a coincidence, because we were very much looking for a place which was, in a way, very open place, a place that is was ready to think of new opportunities. And to be honest, that is in Belgium and in Flanders, or in the center of Europe, sometimes very difficult. So as a young architect, you have a lot of desires to do things, and you are often confronted with a situation where people more block you than use you, in a way. That people, I think a big problem of contemporary society in Europe is that there's a lot of resistance to change. And what we found in Albania was a huge openness to change, to invent, to try out, to at least do something. And so I think this page is already a proof of that quality. Of course, it's a place that openness comes with a lot of problems. Openness of that society today goes for everyone, and it produces both the best and the worst. So this is a typical urban situation in the city of Tirana, with in the back one of the first projects we did, which was to apply a painting on a facade. And this is also part of Tirana, so it is, Albania has had a very almost violent history, a very brutal history of very dictatorial communism. So people that have lived that situation compare it to the situation of North Korea in these days. So a situation that we cannot imagine. And also a situation that has been very violently left behind. So here you see, for instance, a series of monuments behind the National Gallery. So this image only to say that we were confronted with this openness, but also confronted with a certain lack of understanding, and also maybe a realization that we would never really understand, that we should accept that there was a part of that history that we would never be able to understand. When we came there in 2004, the desire of the country was very much to become modern, to become everything that it hadn't been before. So this is the first trip with the private developer of the TID tower from the airport to the city center. And you see already this huge clash between he himself being equipped with all of the paraphernalia of, like the golden watch, the back then very sophisticated smartphone, not even smartphone, but just cell phone. And then indeed, on the outside, very rough, brutal construction. And when we came there had been a first wave of very illegal construction. When we were there was a wave of demolishing a lot of that and trying to restart. So that was in a period of 5 years. They already had this first wave. So the regime more or less collapsed in the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. So in these 10, 15 years, there was already a lot of things happening. The location of the TID tower, of this first project for which we won the competition, was a very intriguing location because it was in the very center of the city. Here you see the Skanderbeg Square, the central square of the city. It had some of the oldest monuments, and there you saw here you see the silhouette of the building. And I think we won the competition for a few reasons. Not because we were experienced, because we were, I think, 30 back then. But because we were somehow able to intuitively respond to a few of their intentions. The first response was to make a building which was capturing the Mediterranean light of the country. So we were very surprised to come into a place that we thought was East European, but was actually proving in the reality of it to be very Mediterranean. And to stress this as a quality was something that for them was unexpected. So you have the kind of same light. It's also a bit recognizable when you when I land in Barcelona, you also have that similar quality of very stark shadows and very strong light. And our proposal was to capture this light with a tower that would be a shape that goes from a round footprint to a square top, where you see that this produces a building which answers the somehow impossibly fine silhouette which was drawn in the master plan, and somehow did a pragmatic proposal to that desire, and shifting in a way the elegance to the way how light and shadow falls onto that shape. A second reason I think why we won the competition was that we proposed basically a quarter of a cupola on top of one of the monuments of the city. So basically finding a relation to something that was there and that was largely overlooked. So we somehow cared for it. And the third reason was that we were able to present the project orally. So we didn't have to show panels only, but we could also share what we thought, what we felt, how we would deal with those observations, and how we thought the building could become intelligent. But we were also able to say that during the competition we were not able to reach that intelligence yet. So we were able to explain how we thought the project should become a kind of laboratory, a work in progress, something that would be shared with the people around the table. And that, I think, is a very unique condition that we do not often find in European tendering, is that you are able to express intentions, you are able to express doubts, and you are able to share somehow how you would set up a dialogue, rather than just convince someone of how smart you are and how well your result is. So I think this, to be able to relieve that fake impression of knowing it all, was actually an opportunity that we could seize and that made us, I think, win. Of course, we had tested some possibilities. So here is the possibility of a mineral facade, which is a condition to capture that light, this condition of light and shadow. And the day after we won, we were sitting together with the developer, and he was saying that he accepted the choice of the jury, but he didn't accept this solution. So very early on, it became clear that it would become, in a way, very difficult. We were also confronted for the first time with his very physical and very emotional way of expressing himself. So we embarked on this journey. So here you see 2005, on how to take these intentions, to try and give solutions to these intentions, but also reshape these solutions according to the local opportunities and the local capacities that we would find. So being there as a young office, an international office by default, also put us very quickly into a situation where we were meeting a lot of other people and where we could set up a series of test projects. And this was one of them, which was the question to build a gas station on the entrance to the city center. And we proposed quite an iconic gas station with a cupola that we wanted to make in brick as a way to test the combination of a cheap material with readily available labor in the country. And so the idea was to use this gas station to become a prime example of what we wanted to do with the tower. This brought us in contact, this project and also other projects with, this is here the client of that gas station, also his office at the time. Office, the place of his current gas station. And this encounter was extremely enriching because he, for instance, is someone who has studied, but took up that enterprise, that endeavor of opening up a gas station because that was the most lucrative. So we also met, for instance, a gynecologist who made pizza because in a way in that country that kind of business produces much more value than. So we were confronted, let's say, one-to-one with a lot of absurdities, and these absurdities were actually very interesting to start to understand how that society works and how things are interpreted and perceived. So the goal of producing that brick dome proved impossible. We tried to set up certain alliances, for instance, with a technical school from Belgium that had this technique of making a dome. But still, he didn't want to try it. But he did agree with the idea of trying to make something that would not be imported, but would be made in Albania. And then we changed the design to become a steel dome, closer to what you think a gas station should be. And then actually to weld construction of that size, the only place possible back then in Tirana was actually an old abandoned steel factory in Elbasan, where the dome was welded by a retired female welder during communism, who produced that dome with a lot of, let's say, passion still, but also with a lot of let's say, with a very little capacity. And I think this was a situation where we were confronted with the actual level or lack of level of building culture in Albania, which produced a result which I think was not entirely ours, but also not entirely theirs. So it was still something which was very different from what other gas stations in Albania were looking like. And so we had found somehow a hybrid, a middle ground, a construction that, even though it was not the thing that we had imagined in the beginning, still had a certain beauty and still had a certain quality. But still, it also questions very much the things we were setting up for the tower project itself, which were, in a way, we tried to make simple things, but the simplicity that we had in mind was still hugely complicated, given the capacities that the local building culture had. And so this is, for instance, a mock-up of the structure that we had in mind, with the type of scaffolding or the type of formwork that they imagined, which was basically horrible, even if you could acknowledge all of the effort that they had put into it. The kind of error margin was simply so visible and so intolerable that it produced a very dumb result, a very unconvincing result. And so we started a process of radically simplifying the design, radically increasing the error margin of the building. So we were looking for ways how to still make a very good building, but in a way a building that is so simple and so robust that even if you build it with a certain error or lack of precision, that it would still be convincing and still be beautiful. And the idea of the mineral facade, so the stone facade, we eventually found a solution that was combining two things. The one thing was that every floor would be cast on site in a specific shape, so this kind of evolving shape with always different triangles, and then to mount on these floors, which were custom made, something that doesn't happen, for instance, in Belgium, where everything is prefabricated. So on these custom made floors, we would mount prefabricated panels, which are these panels, which would be just attached to the floor and which would not touch in between themselves. So you would have the idea of a skin, of a textile, but let's say if this would change 1 or 2 centimeters or even 5 centimeters, it wouldn't hurt so much. And actually it proved to work also in the end, because they built the 13th floor twice. So normally every floor is different, but now one floor is the same for some for some reason, and still in the end result you don't see it. And so this also made possible that the glass facade would just be from floor to ceiling in a very simple way, making the best thing possible. So this produces this type of plan with a core which is also earthquake proof, and then with a series of simple floors, I'm sorry, and with columns which incline in subtle ways. So a building that requires a certain sense of precision but doesn't depend solely on that precision. So this is the built result. You have the tower, and also on this picture you see a part of the footprint with quarter of the dome. And this is the locally produced panel seen from close. So these panels are polished concrete with stone that is sourced in the region, which is built in a factory that is set up especially for that building. And the panel basically produces very beautiful proximity, and also has basically the size of a body. So also the windows that are left out are somehow very human scale, very man-sized or woman-sized, which gives suddenly not only this very abstract skin, very abstract building, but also a very personal experience when you are in the building. And so, funnily enough, with the building having to become so dumb, and with the program also changing so many times, because the developer had a lot of difficulties setting up the right program. So it started out as a mixed-use building. It gradually became, at a certain point, it was a headquarters for a bank. Then it was discussions with international hotel. They didn't work. So basically the whole programming of the building was very shaky, very difficult. And so the only clue that he and also we had was to make something that would host these changes and would produce conditions that, just like in this condition, that could be inhabited by any kind of use. So the building, although it was new, became very much a kind of adaptive reuse project. So trying to look for something that you'd know would be just a shell and that would be inhabited in different ways. And this was also very much the case. So here you see, for instance, a plan drawn for a hotel room, trying to fit it in. But also plans that were produced. This one, for instance, a proposal that we did to him of not making a hotel, but making more very compact apartments for international people to come and live there. Because this is the only building in Tirana, maybe by now one of the few that have fire, let's say, that is according to fire regulations, which has a double fire escape stair, for instance, which a lot of other buildings don't have. So suddenly we thought you could think of different types of use that go beyond the hotel. And the funny thing is that all of these changes for him, it's very imaginable. So he doesn't have a fixed program, he just has a building, he builds at capacity. And still today, even if the hotel is in use, some of the floors are left empty, and he will see what he will do with them. So it's a very organic way of dealing with a building of that size. So this plan is drawn 10 years after the first plans. The building was also, let's say, manipulated quite brutally during the construction process. So, for instance, when he decided to make his own hotel, he had to have a congress venue, which he decided to make in the underground. He started to demolish the floor of the street that was in between the two buildings of the complex. So that's where the floor was connecting. And when he was confronted with that situation, he decided indeed that he would not demolish the structure, which was a heavy discussion with his engineer. We, at the same time, came up with a proposal to put that venue on top of the 3-story building, so which is now has turned into a 4-story building. And we proposed it as a continuation of the facade with a glazed pavilion in the middle of that, which produces, in a way, a very beautiful outdoor patio. Yeah, it sounds maybe very like a caricature, which maybe it is also a bit, but still I think it was very interesting to think of building systems and think of reactions that would take his question and not to say no, because it was not the plan, but to say yes, but in such and such a way. And so to improvise basically with these changing conditions and to invent, to be, let's say, radically flexible, you could say. Luckily by then we were having a good team of engineers so that we could trust also the way how things were being executed. But the exercise was basically about saying yes and to think of the transformation of a building and to think of a building that can adapt to these transformations. So this is a zoom of that demolition, and this is a zoom of the Congress space proposal, which you see here in plan. And interestingly enough, I think a certain formal logics about the building, like this shape that goes from super ellipse, that's a super ellipse that goes from an ellipse to a rectangle, were in that process anchor points, were somehow giving rules to the building, even if they are very artificial, but that somehow would always allow us to reason within a certain system. And so that's an image of the patio in its current state. And so this adaptive reuse produced a building which in 2015 was both figuring in the In-Flight magazine, while at the same time was being transformed and demolished, which is in a way something that happens with buildings anyhow. For instance, this building is an example. Today it is being transformed and still we're using it. But for us was a very interesting exercise to be confronted with it. So to think of buildings basically already from their perspective of their inertia to change, but also their capacity for change, and how you would combine these both things, this resistance and this openness, in an interesting and flexible way. So that's one thing that we learned by doing that building. But another thing that we, I think, learned very much in Albania was to activate the value hidden in the process of architecture. So what I explained now about the building being a building that is open to change, I think this is something that we all share and try to look for and maybe value. Another thing I think which we all do, and I think in maybe if you talk about good architecture in general, that what happens is to activate the value hidden in the process. But we actually think that there's very little discourse about it, or that people don't talk about it that much, and that actually clients and cities and are much more confronted with architects and trying to sell the genius of their solution, but not very much the value that they can have during a process. And the moment that you can work together with someone, that's actually a very valuable moment. And that's, I think, a second thing that we learned very much and that we try to promote as much as possible, is to see architecture very much as a process and to try and activate the value that is hidden in that process. So what does this mean in a very practical way? It basically means that you are in a situation that you discuss with people, but not around the table, be agreeing or disagreeing, but that you are really working together with all of the tools that you have as an architect, models, images, plans, and that you are actually sitting in front of people that you want to make something with. And that's actually a very valuable situation, that you are suddenly are able to transform the dialogue not in an oppositional dialogue, but in a way where you find third solutions in discussing. If you have one person saying the one thing and another person saying another thing, that during the working together you can find other things. And so that's something that we have throughout the years tried to refocus more and more, is that we try to do the modeling like an architect does, but to try and open up that process of the modeling, and also the fact that a lot of things are digital and actually extremely fast and easy somehow, that you can also, by reducing it, making it more efficient, making it more quick, that you can increase the time for dialogue and really value the moments of sitting together, working together much more. And so maybe again in quite abstract words, we actually value a lot the fact that the architecture process produces an environment in which you can work together and learn together, and that you can, as an architect, open up that very much to other people. And why we think this is important is because, in a way, our societies become increasingly complex, and this complexity is often managed by separating things. So everyone has his responsibility, and we think something is managed well if everyone has a very clear task. But it's actually in the reality quite the opposite, is that the most intelligent results come when the knowledge is shared and can transform each other. When you don't have the experts all being right, but that you have people who all don't know or partially know, and that their common collective knowledge produces something intelligent. And again, this is, I think, something that happens in all good architecture, but is, I think, not really producing a discourse today. And this collective learning, we think, is really something that in increasingly complex societies is the way to invent smart and simple solutions and to produce added value. And in the situation of Albania, we were confronted with that complexity. But I think in European societies, in European cities, this complexity is often hidden and is not allowed to bloom. But still, if you look at the kind of complexity that we have inherited, so this is as you can see, a night view of Europe. It is unimaginable that you can manage this. So if you want to add value in that system, it's about rewiring, relinking, recrafting that environment. And we are really convinced that you can only do this if you open up to other people and have multiple intelligence feed into projects. In order to make that story accessible and maybe understandable to ourselves and to others, we have started to make small leaflets, which we call conversation booklets, which try to put into words what these different processes are. So if we talk about urban renewal, we indeed talk about a process that is about adaptive reuse, but also about agent montage, about structuring complexity, about interfaces for open use and making anchoring spaces, and also about enhancing networks. So the second and last part of the lecture will be about trying to explain this, so that maybe we can later have an exchange or a discussion about it. What do we mean with agent montage? Is that actually we were, just like in Tirana, more and more confronted with the situation that also if you think about the existing built environment in European cities is that programs are not clear. So you have existing buildings, and writing down a program often doesn't work. So how do you deal with that situation? And also, if you deal with that situation, if you write a program together with other people, how can you come up with a situation that you somehow empower these people to also become creative and to become actors in that process? So not just to hand you something ready-made, but to somehow think along and produce an openness in how the building could be used. One situation that we were confronted with that allowed us to test this agent montage was a situation for the competition in the central square of Tirana, the Skanderbeg Square competition, which in the beginning we won through a competition, which we produced a plan for together with the municipality and the politicians, and that we found ourselves that in September 2011, after a few years of producing that project, that the political constellation changed and that the project was so much linked to just a few people that they could just stop it and no one would even know. There was a bit of communication, as you see here, just before the elections, but there was no real network of people around this project. And so when the political constellation changed again recently, we decided to try and do that differently and to use the project to do this agent montage, basically to build this alliance of people around it and to use the project as a platform to organize alliances, to organize stakeholders. It started with a mapping of what had changed. So this is the mayor on his socks on a big model showing the difference between the situation in 2011 and the situation in 2016. But then also basically we made a model of our project, which was the projects in its most simple, and then set up a series of situations, dialogue settings around the project and trying to trigger people to invent it in different ways and from different perspectives. So during, I think, a period of 3-4 months, we both had a very intense work with all the technical people again in Tirana, but also a very explicitly open process where we were sharing the fact that the project was to a large extent undefined, maybe to a large extent didn't produce the right choices. For instance, the project was very mineral and maybe not very green. And so we were somehow collecting, sharing these thoughts, which was in a way a thing that never happened in Tirana before. And it produced ideas which were about reorganizing the ring road around the project, but also, for instance, very simple and basic ideas like making a book garden where the National Library is, and somehow to produce links between the project and its surroundings in a very simple and very organic way. And actually this kind of process of offering the project as a very basic frame and then allowing with that frame to for a program to be invented was also something that we have tested and experimented with in Belgium, here for the Buddha Factory, which is a project for the refurbishment of an existing building that the city had bought, that the city wanted to have a cultural function, but they didn't really know what that cultural function would be and what would work. And so basically we produced, alongside with the definition of the program, also a building that would still offer a sense of clarity, even if a lot of the building definition could not be made because simply they didn't have a very clear view on what they wanted. And so how did we react to that situation? We basically made a proposal where the center of the building was having an atrium, a clear void that the shape of which we found by taking away a few of the beams. And then we repeated that found form in the form of a pavilion in front of the building. These two interventions absorbing the most of the budget that we had, producing somehow out of a factory building a public building by having these two spaces. One space, an entrance pavilion, another space, a space that organizes the circulation. And then we tried to manipulate all of the choices to be as pragmatic as possible, but also to reveal somehow the beauty of the building. So here the floor is existing, the ceiling is existing, but the brick is new, and so it produces a new whole. And then together with the client, we invented a series of actions that you could do that allowed them to program the building gradually. And maybe I will just explain one, but so one thing that happened, for instance, is that not all spaces were treated and brought to standard in a similar way. So some of the spaces were left without insulation, some of the spaces were left even without heating, in the idea that their occupation of that building would change during the seasons. And then they had very little things to start with, and then basically we came to the conclusion together that at the entrance of the building there would not be a reception, but there would basically be an atelier, a kind of fab lab in its most brute form, and that the one person actually that would run this fab lab would also be the receptionist and would somehow manage the whole building. So to collapse basically the program into one core, the core of that fab lab, and that with that one presence that they could flexibly swell or inflate the occupation of the building. And so it would mean that the building would have a daily life, a daily use, in which only maybe 20% of the building is used. Then when there's an exhibition, the Fab Lab can produce the exhibition. The exhibition can open up a few rooms. And this goes to the moment where, for some events, during weekends, there were up to 80,000 people passing through the building in one weekend. But these kinds of solutions, of course, we cannot invent ourselves, but maybe also they cannot invent themselves. And so we then stepped into, and so all of these discussions, all of these choices, like very pragmatically, were discussed together with them, but were also continued to be discussed after the delivery of the building, where we would still change and transform part of the building, like changing openings, adding, for instance, openable balustrade and stuff like this. And we also did together with them for a certain time a kind of mapping of everything that was happening in the building, and then having very small reviews once in a while to see how we could improve the building to allow these questions that they were confronted with. So somehow the building in all its simplicity allowed them to gradually build the program. So now the Fab Lab has enough users that they can take it away from the entrance and it will be moved upstairs. So the building, together with organizing that process, manages to really grow a program rather than to write and roll it out. So here you see this kind of post-occupancy as found situations that they were producing. And I think that's something valuable to think about when we think about this organic growth, is that the things that are stable are in that building more these two spaces, these two centers, and the things that are extremely flexible are the perimeter, the facade. So for instance, now they are building next to it elderly home, of which we are not the architects, but the discussion is about sharing that garden, for instance, opening up this facade. This is actually the entrance to the parking garage of that building, but which becomes an extension on the upper floors of that building. This space is a space being shared with the creche, which is here, the daycare center. So I think that's a valuable lesson, that to organize buildings almost more as urban fabric and less as objects or containers. Of course, all of this is extremely fuzzy terrain. We step into a lot of situations and conditions where we do not really know how to handle it. Where maybe the only power that we have is that we acknowledge that we don't know. But a thing that we have started doing as well is to structure that complexity in its different objectives or different purposes, where both the dialogue process and the maybe more architectural processes are aligned to each other, and that we check how the one can feed the other. And this happens with very simple tools. For instance, for Skanderbeg Square, we have produced a process booklet, which contains a set of references and a set of intentions that come from very different sides, where we also take the responsibility to visualize and somehow capture references that come from other people. And we produce that kind of common imagination that you can, because of its simplicity, this A5 format, can start to structure in extremely simple, straightforward ways. And this simplicity is actually also very engaging for people. In Tirana, this has led to the Skanderbeg Square actually activating a lot of even private initiative around it. In Saint-Nazaire, where we have won a competition in this submarine base, to make in one of the parking garages for submarines festivity hall. We have used the process of drawing what the context is as a way to define what the strategic impact of this simple program could be. So City of Saint-Nazaire has since a long time, since 20 years, gradually invested in cultural program in that building, and the program that we were building was adding up to it. It's a building which is extremely beautiful, but also very difficult. And so they are trying to turn this into a public destination. Without a lot of budget, but incrementally doing things. And so every decision that you take ideally has strategic value and produces a kind of master plan, rather than that you first have a master plan that you then roll out, that you check, that simple decisions like where do you put the entrance, where is the logistics, that it produces somehow something that has value beyond the value of the building alone, but also produces public space, puts into attention some values. And so one drawing that we produced for this project to capture that and to structure that complexity is something that we call an urban reality drawing, which is a drawing which draws the architecture scale and the urban scale at once with the same level of detail, so that you can zoom in and zoom out. And we started the competition with this type of frame, where we thought the building related very much to the city center. But through discussions, we noticed that they saw things differently. And so with this drawing, we basically captured it was like a compte rendu, like a report of every meeting. Every meeting, the drawing changed. Digitally, that's very simple. You can shift it. So we reframed the drawing. We started to make it more precise, to highlight the elements that are important. For instance, this basin turned out to be very important. And so gradually we understood all of the things that were happening that were not documented in some way, but that we could link to and that we could react to. And so the drawing becomes a drawing of absorbing information, but also giving it back, allowing it to put in the middle of the table, and to immediately pick up on a discussion, seeing that complexity represented. And so here you see how some of the choices, I will not go into the detail of it, but I think you get the idea. And so being able to zoom in also suddenly makes some choices like where do you put the entrance, extremely valuable. So it's not treated as a minor question, but it's every time checked in its strategic impact. And that's how we came up with the proposal of a mobile billetterie, how do you call it, ticketing office, which could both activate the building but also the public space. Something that was accepted at that point, but now that we are constructing the building is again questioned. And this kind of scenario thinking, I think it's something, so to think of buildings as infrastructure and to think of program as scenarios, it's something that you can really open up. So we make very simple models, for instance, and then I think what happens is a bit like when you play as a child, that you have this prop to allow you yourself to imagine. This is a capacity that if you offer the right tools, that almost any client still can do, but he simply doesn't get the tools to do that. And actually this type of game, if you could call it, or this kind of very basic, simple model, is a really interesting tool to activate a client and to put them not only in a critical mode, but also in a productive mode. Where you suddenly start to get a project which is thought from different perspectives, but with the same formats and with the same tools. I think it has become already clear during the few explanations I gave of some projects that more and more we shift away from looking at architecture as this kind of object and shift the attention more to what kind of spaces anchor a project, and that we take the boundary of a project not for granted, but we try to look for things that can structure buildings. So anchoring spaces in that approach is very important. One example in the TID building is this quarter of a dome, which surprisingly, even by the private developer, was never questioned. He never proposed to make an entrance in that facade, although it's somehow the best facade, you could say. And so I think there is an interest in finding the things that are acknowledged and recognized by everyone. I will not. And so somehow the shape of the building, of the tower, and the shape of that dome were the anchor points of that building, that in the large part in the space in between these two things changed and was manipulated a lot. And you can also see at the lack of order in this plan that it's the result of that kind of negotiation. And so structuring spaces that are negotiable and spaces that are unnegotiable, I think, is a very important aspect in opening up the discussion. When I jump back to the Skanderbeg Square, with this abundance of space, we made this distinction there by proposing the project as a very clear square, an actual square, with around it a series of gardens. And so the square somehow is the collective decision, also the decision that we are the guarantee of. And the gardens become more kind of thing that can evolve, can, within a very simple framework, can offer a lot of diversity and a lot of difference. So here you see the view of the square seen from the gardens. And the definition of that, of the anchor space of that square is actually very simple. It is a very flat pyramid. It slopes up 4%, so it means that if you stand in the middle, you are 2.7, I think it has changed in the meantime, but 2.7 meters higher than on the edge. So suddenly the shape becomes a very dynamic shape, even if it's just a square. And so if you stand in the middle of that square, you are suddenly on the top, in the center, and it's a really very specific space. Something that it does is that suddenly the middle of the square is at equal height as these monumental stairs of the building surrounding it, so that basically without touching the stairs, we completely change their impact. And something which it also does is that we have proposed a series of water points on that square, of which, so if you then have water flowing, so it's not fountains but more water that is flowing, that it flows in 4 directions, which allows then a kind of dry path on the diagonals. And then this water produces on that very rigid monumental square situations of randomness and of frivolity, you could say. Today the square is being executed, and there we also found a way how to do it, a way that is informed both by the fact that we didn't want this square to be one thing, maybe, and also the fact that we had to produce this in a very limited amount of time suddenly, so that we had to source a lot of materials at once, which made us produce the link to one of the things that we found during the process of developing the tower, which is the huge variety of resources in Albania, so a lot of different stones, which made us produce a proposal in which this square would become almost like a national mosaic, made of very different types of natural stone, which would be mixed and matched to produce different color fields, so that you have, if you walk on the square, a completely different scale. So this gives an idea of the variety of stones that Albania has, some of which are being sourced, others which are not. And so this has also become part of the Skanderbeg Square, is to source these stones, trying to manage their availabilities and their, together with the design that we produced, basically producing a square which looks, if you look at it from far, it is sawn in a rough way, so that it actually looks rather white, because of the dust as well. But then once you start to put water on it with these fountains, that you actually temporarily polish the surface, and that the roughness becomes smooth and transparent, and it produces an effect like this. Where you almost, with the water, reveal a sudden richness and complexity of the veins of the stones. So it produces a square where you feel the module, but also see the field. And this field, indeed, so this is a construction site situation. When it's, now there's also a bit of cement on it, but basically in its dry state it would be very white, but in its wet state it would reveal all of these differences. And differences which also produce suddenly a very small, a very different way of perceiving it, where, and this is a visit with the family, but where you suddenly see that this whole square also becomes something that you can relate to in a very tactile and physical way. And this kind of space also allows to absorb the huge changes, so the events in life. Something that, this is not a picture of a very recent picture, but that suddenly also this big emptiness can host festivals and can produce a collectivity on a different scale. And this is also something that we think is valuable to think about these two time frames in the scale of a building. So this is a refurbishment of a house in Flanders, in in which we have proposed the extension of the room to become like an undefined, overscaled space, a space without a program, a space that feels both inside and outside. And this is a picture of an office party we were able to do there. And then this central room, a bit like on the square, this anchor space, produces a lot of differences around it. And somehow becomes the place where a lot of differences meet. And a space also defined just by a floor and a roof. And a space that in a house not only tries to think about the functions like cooking or living, but also to think about the moments in life which are really valuable, like having parties or inviting a lot of people, or being alone in a certain sense of emptiness. And I'm sorry. As you can probably tell, I have a bit of a cold. I also noticed that I'm rather slow today, so I don't know if I should speed up or if it's okay. Okay. And so this is a view of that house, both a view on the central space and one of the annex spaces next to it. This idea of the anchor space is complemented with a focus on what we try to call interfaces for open use. And the square is an example of that. So you have the zero space, which is the anchor space, but then a series of gardens around it, which are designed to somehow become a very thick border and to become a space where a lot of small encounters, small exchanges can happen. So, for instance, redesigning the stairs that lead to the National Museum to become both an entrance to the National Museum, but also integrated in a series of paths which circle around the square and different ways of sitting. And the same goes for the parking which is under the square, which is a program that was added recently. And this entrance is like one of the gardens sinking down, but also then producing a parking which is too high to just park cars, but which then can allow a certain margin for other things to be organized. And especially in a city like Tirana, but I think this is also basically the quality of any European city, that is different scaling and this inadaptation, this unadapted city, if you could call it. That's actually a lot of the value, that there's a lot of margin, there's a lot of leeway to start to invent and imagine other things to happen. In the TID tower, there is actually one space that has this quality, which is, so if you have here the tower, here you have this 3-story building that became the 4-story building, you have the underground, and then you have a 5-story office part of the complex. Is that in between there is a space which is 10 meters wide and 5 stories high, which basically lets the city flow through the project and produces a kind of proximity which I think is very enriching and is one of the really sustainable qualities of European cities specifically. And this is also then what produces this kind of soft proximities. So this is a view from the lobby of the 5-star hotel at this passage space towards the office building that houses a call center. And these kind of interfaces, I think, make projects absorb scale difference and really produce a kind of proximity and softness in cities, which I think is very, very valuable. And maybe to have it speak for itself, I will show a small movie that shows that space in use. From that point of view, you also see the tower in its context, which is a post-communist context. So very big buildings, very large and empty spaces. So here the Skanderbeg Square in its emptiness will come. But actually, all of this space has a lot of potential to become a very specific type of city center. And of course, especially, for instance, if you go through the city center of Barcelona, this kind of narrowness and this kind of intimacy is really exciting. It's also, and so the question here is how to produce that. Not with buildings, but with green. I will skip this part just to not to. We can maybe come back to it later. And so, if I jump to this idea of how one action can become part of a network that you produce, I would like to explain it with Skanderbeg Gardens, which is, as I said before, maybe the most fuzzy part of the project, but which I think will become somehow the future image of it, and also the future quality, a quality which could make of Tirana a very inviting Mediterranean city. And so what we started to do with these gardens is to discuss their components very specifically with the biologist, so that we can start to imagine it as both a representation but also an embodiment of the qualities of that Mediterranean environment. So here you see again the openness of the space, and here the kind of a space which is basically grass field with trees on top of it. And what we would like to produce is more the idea of a kind of urban jungle, a place where you could get lost in, and that is also made more out of different layers, and that can, in that sense, become both more resilient, because it's somehow a system that strengthens itself, that is less weak in the summer, for instance, but also can produce a very different type of experience. And so this is a very quick collage of what these type of pockets could be. So really to have a scented city center with smell. and also to produce this kind of sublayer which has a completely different scale than the scale of the center. And what is interesting about it is that this project, which is I think one of the biggest tree plantations of Europe in these days. So we plant thousands of trees and even more shrubs around the square, and we have done so by choosing very specific species, which are species that you find in Albania, and we have also started to set up nurseries together with the biologist and the contractor, not only for this project, because the time span is too short, but basically also for future projects, so that this square could somehow start to grow outwards. So that's here you see it, and start to become a model that you could start to develop along this central spine, and that would relate very specifically to the three ecosystems that you find in Albania, so that the visiting of the square would also become kind of encounter with the diversity that you find in the territory, in the country that surrounds it. And in that sense, becoming in a way a model of how you could, through actions and through becoming very specific about how you do things, start to reshape and recraft this environment that I have shown you before. So these six topics as a way to round up, a way how we try to, as I said in the beginning, try to think architecture as a transformation process, how we try to add different dimensions to it, and how we try to deal with the complexity. A lot of these stories are to be found in this book, as I was saying, and I'm very open for questions. So please shoot if you want to.